Alan Stoga es un distinguido estratega y empresario con amplia experiencia en comunicación y relaciones públicas, consultoría corporativa, medios digitales, geopolítica, la banca y el gobierno. Actualmente se desempeña como asesor senior de Kissinger Associates, firma de consultoría internacional dirigida por el Dr. Henry Kissinger. Asimismo, es presidente de Semi Communications, empresa neoyorquina proveedora de servicios de asesoría en comunicación a clientes ubicados fuera de los Estados Unidos. Kissinger Associates es una empresa consultora de negocios internacionales que asesora empresas a nivel mundial. Esta las ayuda a entender y gestionar oportunidades, problemas y negociaciones complejas que podrían impactar en su desempeño operativo. Por otra parte, SEMI, constituida en 1996, asesora a organizaciones en comunicación estratégica. También ofrece una amplia gama de servicios que incluyen la comunicación de ejecutivos, relaciones con medios, relaciones con inversionistas y programas de comunicación corporativa interna. La especialidad digital de SEMI surge como una evolución del Flip, revista digital en línea publicada por el señor Stoga entre el 2007 y 2009. Esta premiada revista aprovechaba todas las funcionalidades del Internet para producir una nueva experiencia digital capaz de capturar la atención de sus clientes. En ese mismo contexto, durante 4 años fue secretario de los premios anuales Multimedia Awards de la WordPress Photo Association. En los primeros años de su carrera fundó una firma de capital privado de 1995 a 96 y fue director general del Kissinger Associates de 84 a 95. Fungió como economista en jefe de la Comisión Nacional Bipartidista en América Central, creada por el presidente Reagan de 1982 a 1983 y estableció y administró las actividades de la División de Gestión de Riesgos de País en el First National Bank de Chicago del 77 al 84 y fue economista internacional del Departamento de la Tesorería de los Estados Unidos del 75 a 77. Durante los años 90, Alan Stoga también fue director de Alliance Capital Management y hoy en día es el actual presidente del Consejo de la Fundación Tällberg, con sede en Suecia, y de la Fundación Thinker y vicepresidente del Consejo de la Sociedad de las Américas. Asimismo, es miembro del Consejo de Relaciones Exteriores y tiene una maestría en Relaciones Internacionales de la Universidad de Yale. Tras obtener su licenciatura en Economía de la Universidad de Michigan, es un conferencista y escritor que frecuentemente aborda temas sobre política y economía, tanto a nivel mundial como de los Estados Unidos. Alan, bienvenido, te escuchamos.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio. I apologize that this is going to be in my bad English, but you will be pleased it's not in my even worse Spanish. As Jose Antonio said, this is a very, very bizarre American election. I first voted in presidential election in 1972, and in my lifetime there has been literally nothing like this. And indeed, as we just saw in England a couple days ago, I think in general, country after country after country is going through a transition from what we knew and were very comfortable with for 50, 60, 70 years to someplace that is totally new. We've never seen anything like this. It is certainly true in the United States. What I'll try to do today is very simply give you my sense of what are the factors at work in the United States, what caused Trump, which I know is your concern, how the election might be decided, and the one thing I will not tell you is who I think is going to win, because I have no idea. So with that, what I'd like to do, though, is the point of departure has to be, how did Trump happen? I think most people are making a mistake by trying to understand Donald Trump rather than trying to understand the United States. Trump is a lagging indicator. He's not a leading indicator. He's not a leader, he's a follower. He's produced by a set of things going on in the United States. And I would argue if it wasn't Trump, it would have been somebody else we don't know or didn't expect. These numbers are repeated in poll after poll after poll. Most Americans, when they think about their politicians, when they think about their government, are angry, they're frustrated. Almost everyone in the country, tiny, tiny people notwithstanding, almost everyone in the country thinks government is failing them, thinks politicians are failing them. They want something different. Ask Democrats, ask Republicans, overwhelmingly they say, what I really want for a president is none of the above. And indeed, Donald Trump is none of the above. 2/3 of Americans, when asked the question, was life better 50 years ago for people like you, say it was either worse or it was the same. Now think of 50 years. 2016 minus 50 is the mid-60s. There is not a single person in the United States, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, who's not better off, whose family is not better off, whose opportunities are not better off. But they don't think so. They have this memory of something that used to be much better, something that they used to, that at least them or their families were better off. And then ask them the question, what about the future? And again, 70% say it's going to be either worse or the same. That is a nation that you're not used to. You're used to a confident America, a confident United States that is confident in its future, is going somewhere. That doesn't exist anymore. Our voters are not, our people are not, even if our politicians think they are. If you then ask the financial question, if you then can make the slide move, too fast. From a financial point of view, when you were younger and you thought about your future, do you think you're better off, worse off? A majority of Americans, and this is coming through in poll after poll after poll, we think we are worse off than we expected to be. That again feeds frustration. Why is that? That's why. That is a plot of real median income over the last couple decades. Today, the real median income in the United States, the average household income is about $53,000. That is, as you can see, the same as it was years ago. Americans then to then have not had a raise, and they're not happy about it. Unfortunately, what has happened is everything's gotten more expensive. So you all know the American dream because you see it in TV and movies, right? We're all supposed to have 2 kids, single-family house, kids go to college, 2 cars in the driveway. If you actually price that out, what would the American dream cost in today's dollars? It costs about $110,000 to have the American dream. If you're only making $55,000 or $53,000, you can't afford the American dream anymore. Again, why are people angry and frustrated? Because they're looking at a present they can't afford. They're even more sure that they're looking at a future that they won't be able to afford. But the story goes on, and I apologize, this is a tough one. The headline is what matters. In most countries in Europe, developed countries, as time passes, you're supposed to live longer. And this is a plot of time passing, and as you can see, because it's upside down, as that line falls, it means that the expectancy of death is falling. You know, we're all going to die eventually. We want to die later, not sooner. The only country in the industrial world that is experiencing the opposite, that top red line, is that white Americans are dying at an increasing rate in the last year, since the turn of the century. Why are they dying faster? And something like 500,000 people have died that should not have died if you do the demographics. Why? Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and suicide. And those of you who travel in Europe, I just described to you Russia, an aging society that's not happy, that literally is killing itself. Now that you can see way down there, there's a second arrow. That is U.S. Hispanics. U.S. Hispanics' life expectancy is continuing to improve very steadily, just as happens throughout Europe, as happens in Japan. How does that translate into what we want from the rest of the world? I apologize that many of you probably can't read this, but this is a much bigger room than I expected. First question, what should the U.S. do with regard to other countries? Should we help or should we not help? Essentially, 2/3 of Americans, short of 2/3, 60% of Americans, say no, their problems are their problems, they should cope with them themselves. We don't have the resources to help. We don't have the resources to keep on doing what we have systematically done literally since 1948. On the right-hand side, in terms of solving world problems, do we do too much or too little? Again, the highest answer, 41%, we're doing too much. U.S. involvement in the global economy, good or bad? You can see the numbers. A small majority, and this number's been growing steadily in recent years, think that the more global the economy, the less well we are treated. Again, this is part of a story which is essentially saying we're tapped out. We have problems at home. We have failing infrastructure. Those of you who travel in the United States know that many of our airports are embarrassments. Those of you who travel in our subways know that our subways and railroads aren't world class. The story goes on and on and on, and people, Republican or Democrat or independent, and about a third, more or less it skews a third, are saying it's time to solve our own problems first. We don't have the resources to solve the rest of the world's problems. That makes sense, it's natural, but it's a big change. And the importance of it is that the rest of the world still expects the United States to behave the way it's behaved, more or less, for the last 50 years. So every time there's a disaster somewhere, every time a Greece gets into trouble, or every time there's a mess in the Middle East or a mess in Asia, someone says, we need a new Marshall Plan. I remember when I was working on the Central America Commission back under President Reagan, and of course, we need a new Marshall Plan. The U.S. should provide a lot of money to solve the problems. The point I want to leave you with on this part of the discussion is we as Americans, as a body politic, put our politicians and bureaucrats aside for a minute, we as the body politic are saying, no, sorry, it was good while it lasted, but we're not going to keep on doing it into the future. I don't think the world understands that. So that's the backdrop to that. I would, and since the press is here, I'm happy to say this on the record, the bad news about the U.S. election is that somebody's going to win. One of these two candidates, and they are, each in their own way, are very, very unusual candidates. Trump first. The Make America Great Again stuff I hope makes sense based on all of those numbers I just showed you. Americans think the past was better. They think it was a better country years ago. They think the future is scary. So what do you want to do? You want to go forward to a scary future or backward to something that you think was much better? That's an easy one. Let's make America great again. By the way, I think that's exactly why Brexit won the other day. Let's make Britain Great Britain again was more or less what the voting was about, although it's a somewhat longer story. What do we know about Donald Trump? Think of Trump. He calls himself a builder, and those of you who are builders, I apologize for him doing that. What he is a developer. A developer is different than a builder. What a developer does is put deals together, takes a slice off the top, and moves on to the next transaction. And as you think about what kind of president might he make, all I can tell you is that think of him as someone who, from a personality point of view, is fundamentally a transactional person. He thinks of the world in transactional terms. He wants to get this deal done and then move on to the next deal. He's got to win every deal, by the way. And in his imagination, if you read his books, he has won every deal, put aside the 4 bankruptcies, et cetera. But he's a transactional person. He's a chess player. I'm sorry, he's a checkers player, not a chess player. He is a person who is 100% comfortable in his own skin. On the record, someone asked him, who's your foreign policy advisors? And he said, I get up every morning, I look in the mirror, and I'm my own advisor. Now, every president I've known, every head of state I've known would answer the question the same way, but not on the record. You don't confess that to anybody. He thinks it's normal. He is a risk taker. He is quite comfortable taking huge risks. And finally, he is incredibly pragmatic. He is not ideological. That's not to say he doesn't have values. That's a different discussion. He may or may not have values. But he has no ideology. So, like a good New Yorker, he used to be in favor of abortion, pro-gender rights. Now, as a Republican candidate for the presidency, he can't be either of those. You could say that's an evolution. It actually seems more that I don't have an ideology, unlike someone like Senator Cruz, who is was a very ideological candidate. This guy is pragmatist. It's whatever I need to get the deal done. And the deal right now is getting elected president of the United States. He'll do whatever it takes to get elected. Secretary Clinton is what we call in the business a known known. There are no surprises when it comes to Mrs. Clinton. She's been on the global stage now for decades. There's nothing that I can say that would say, oh, I hadn't thought of that before. Think of her as a super corporate lawyer. She's the sort of corporate lawyer that you don't ask, how do I get from here to way over there? You say, here's the brief. I want to win this transaction. I want to do this right. Go memorize that brief. Go learn it. She'll come back and she'll know her brief better than you know her brief. Friends who've worked for her in the State Department saw her as almost a perfect Secretary of State. Unlike other Secretaries of State who were suddenly, instead of going this way, going that way, and they didn't bother telling you that they were in fact always going that way. Clinton is very cautious. She's not a risk taker. She moves in a constant direction. She is extremely smart, and she's very competent. There is, as I said, however, there are no surprises with Secretary Clinton. For all sorts of tactical reasons, think of and I'll come back to this at the end, if you think about, well, what kind of president might Secretary Clinton make, it would be Obama 3. She more or less is running as the third term for which President Obama is not eligible to run, in the same way that George H.W. Bush, George Bush I, ran as the third term for Reagan, and for the same reason. Bush couldn't have been elected without Reagan. Hillary cannot be elected without the support of President Obama. I'll explain the coalitions in a moment, but she needs him to be elected. And the amazing thing is that as Obama's presidency has come towards its end, his popularity has gone up. Now, you can debate why is that true. At least some of my pollster friends argue people like him more now that he's leaving, for the same reason they liked him before he became president. So he's not a danger anymore. He's a popular president, or rather his popularity is now just snugged over 50%, which is about the best numbers he's had since those very first days. What's one of the many things that's weird about this election is this. We have never had two candidates as unpopular as these two candidates. Everybody knows Hillary, so you see those lines. The red line is if you have an unfavorable opinion of Secretary Clinton. The whatever color that is, black, my wife insists I'm colorblind, is if you have a favorable opinion, it's flat. There are no surprises in the campaign. You don't like Hillary. Most of my friends in New York, certainly anybody who's ever voted Republican, despises Secretary Clinton, although they despise Donald Trump worse, so you have this on the Trump side, 60% of Americans unfavorable opinion, something in the order of 36, 37, 35 favorable opinion. As I said at the start, one of these two has to win, but we're not happy about it. We're presented with two bad alternatives, which says something about the nature of politics as it now exists in the United States, something about the parties, and I think that's a larger point and a larger discussion. But what you really care about is why Donald Trump, and as I said, Make America Great Again perfectly resonates with a lot of voters who think their past was better than their present. Fact of the matter is, all the demographic stuff you hear all the time notwithstanding, yes, we are becoming a minority-majority country. Yes, Hispanics, blacks, Asians will eventually be the majority, not so eventually, but they don't vote, and they're not voting this time. So something on the order of 3/4 of voters in the United States likely to vote this time are in fact white. In America, race still matters enormously, and this is a racial election. To make the long story very short, if Trump wins, he wins because of white votes. If Hillary wins, I'll show you some numbers again in a minute, she wins because she puts together the kind of coalition that President Obama won with 8 years ago and then reelected 4 years ago. Remember that most Americans know Donald Trump, if they know him at all, as a reality TV show host. I don't know how many of you watched The Apprentice. I never did, although if you want to understand Donald Trump, I would have your kids go find you some old versions of The Apprentice. What was the persona of Donald Trump on that TV show? He was decisive. He seemed intelligent. He's very successful, and he keeps on telling you how successful he is. He makes decisions. He doesn't do what most politicians do, which is sort of like economists. On the one hand, on the other hand, and on the third hand, he says, boom, you're fired. And so they saw over a decade and a half or even longer, they saw someone who, with all of what they see as the mess in Washington, because people won't make decisions, we're paralyzed, et cetera, they saw a guy who didn't look like a crazy man to them, didn't look like some right-wing nut. They saw him as a successful American business story, and someone who was willing to speak, and I use this word very advisedly, truth to power. I'll come back to truth in a moment. The obvious question is, are enough whites in the country voting? The short answer is maybe, because it's going to be all about turnout. And the question is whether he will succeed in getting whites to vote even more. I'll show you some numbers in a second. And that the people who elected Obama will vote a little less. We're getting to truth. One thing you've got to understand in an American election is truth has absolutely nothing to do with anything. This is a cartoon. The bad news is those are the facts. So an organization recently fact-checked, and I would really hope that somebody in Mexico takes up this habit, fact-checked all the recent speeches of Donald Trump and of Hillary Clinton. And they've got 6 categories ranging from actually true to outrageously false. There's an American description, your pants are on fire, it's so false. 75% of what passes for facts in Donald Trump's speeches are either mostly false, or so outrageously false we can't even believe he just said that. 75%. Now that you would think would matter to an audience. Unfortunately, it turns out that Secretary Clinton, who is more truthful, truth not being 0-1 anymore, but almost 30% of what she uses as facts aren't facts, although she isn't, look on pants on fire, she doesn't literally just make things up out of whole cloth. Only 1% of hers are made up ideas. But the problem there is you can't, there's high moral ground for neither candidate. If 27% of what you say is not true, yelling at the other guy for not being true doesn't get you very far. So the truth isn't relevant to winning. The election's 134 days from now. Every time you read about another poll and Trump's catching up, he's not catching up, she's far ahead, she's not far ahead, ignore it because they don't tell you absolutely anything. This is all noise. It tells you absolutely nothing. For what it's worth, there's about, on average, a 7-point gap between the two if you average all the polls. It's probably widened a little bit. Trump had a bad couple weeks with truth and other things. So maybe it's a little bit more than that. Absolutely irrelevant to anything. This, like Brexit, is going to be close. At least everything I think I know about America says this is likely to be a close election for a lot of reasons. And I apologize. This is actually the most important thing, and you can't read it, so I apologize. The headline's the headline. If the the demographics change, we have more Hispanic voters, obviously. We don't have more black voters. Things move around a little bit in 4 years. But if the demographics, the electoral demographics of 2012 are repeated in 2016, Clinton wins big. One thing you have to keep in mind as you think about our election is that it's not a popular vote. It's not quite as bad as Brexit, which was an advisory referendum, in fact. But it doesn't matter just that you win, it matters where you win. The Electoral College has 540 seats. You have to win 540 minus 1. You have to have 270 votes in the Electoral College. Each state has votes in proportion to its population. So California really, really matters. New York really, really matters. Texas matters. Vermont, not so much. If, as I said, if the past repeats Clinton wins by a couple percentage points, 4 points, that's a huge win in electoral terms. Far more importantly, she gets well north of 300 electoral votes, and that is a landslide in American political terms. Question is, what might change? And someone recently looked at these 5 states, and this is probably the 5 states. If you're looking for things to follow, one of the things you want to follow is not what's going on in California. I can tell you, they're going to vote Democratic. What's happening in these 5 states is what's going to matter. If candidate Trump does 3% better than candidate Romney in Ohio, and everything else stays the same, he wins Ohio. Ohio is one of those states with a lot of electoral votes. Ditto Iowa, New Hampshire, small but swingable. Florida is huge, Virginia is huge. The second column says, okay, well, what if more Hispanics vote for Hillary than voted for Obama? If more blacks vote for Hillary than voted for Obama, that's not going to happen, by the way. Those numbers grow like that. The arithmetic isn't important. What's important is you can flip the outcome. It really, if you hold everything else equal and say, okay, what if white voters, white non-college voters, vote just a little bit more and vote more Republican than Democrat, and the polls say they're doing that so far. That's what we know from the polls. Then Trump's president of the United States come next January 20th. Now, everything's in play. Everything's popping up, down, and sideways. This is one simple simulation. But the point I want to leave you with on this is a simple one. Whatever those national polls are saying today, I'd ignore it, because I can figure, and if I can figure it, I guarantee you that people much smarter than I can figure out how could he become president. There are many, many paths to a Trump presidency. One of the things we'll see in a few weeks, because we have the conventions coming next month, is both candidates are going to have to choose their vice presidential nominees. The way the world works, you choose X, X is the nominee, so there's not a competition unless you want there to be one. Secretary Clinton, you would expect, would do what American candidates always do. You would say, well, who do I need to win this race? I need one of those, maybe I need a Southerner, or I need a Hispanic, or I need a black, and she'd pick one of those based on how they think those maps look. So if you look today at the list of potential vice presidential candidates on the Democratic side, other than Tim Kaine, who's from Virginia, but I just showed you Virginia is a state that she cannot let go to the Republicans or she's not president. There's several Hispanic possibilities, and there's Elizabeth Warren. It would be really interesting and a bit stunning if Secretary Clinton chose Elizabeth Warren as the candidate. That would tell you two things. One, she's actually done something unpredictable, which would be great. And two, she really, really wants the Sanders revolution inside her tent. Elizabeth Warren speaks directly to that generation, to people of that background, and you would end up with a much more, if they were to win, with an administration that moves much further left than a lot of the conventional wisdom, which expects Hillary to sort of more or less stay with, to be more Bill than Obama. I don't think that's going to happen, but that choice would tell you that. On the Republican side, I know no one, and I've tried real hard, who has a clue what Trump will do. Partly because I know no one who really knows how he thinks, and partly because this is the first decision that he's got that's not transactional, that he's got to stick with. You can't throw your vice presidential candidate away in a day. So we're going to know something about, more than we know at the moment, how's he thinking about this race? Does he really think he has a chance? I think he does. What does he think he needs maybe to govern, possibly to win? So I would be stunned, not the first time in my life, if he chose someone like Sarah Palin, who was palpably unqualified for the job and probably did as much to defeating her ticket as did Obama to defeating her ticket. So we're going to see whether he chooses a serious person, someone either from the business world or the political world, someone who could actually run things. He's on the record as having said, believe it or not, I actually don't want to run the government day to day. He sort of wants to be the non-executive chairman, gets to make the big decisions and do the speeches, and I want somebody who actually can make the machinery work. We'll see whether, in fact, he does that. Let me just briefly talk about policy, because since you're looking at the other end of the wall and the other end of tariffs and the other end of all sorts of things, the obvious question is, what would a President Trump or President Clinton actually do? This was the Boston Globe, bless their souls, after the New York Times sold them, put together a mock mock-up of what they think their front page might look like next April, several months into a Trump presidency. And obviously they stack the deck. Boston is one of those very pro-democratic cities, and with the obvious headline, deportations to begin. Should anybody believe that Trump will do anything he says he's going to do? The answer is absolutely, positively. One of the things that's happened over the last 40 years, really, is that there has been a dramatic shift in the power towards the presidency. Whereas I would argue in this country, Los Pinos is a shadow of what it used to be structurally. In the United States, the White House is dramatically stronger. It's dramatically stronger because the Congress is dramatically weaker. They essentially can't pass legislation anymore. So whether it be a Republican or a Democrat, whether it be an Obama or George W. Bush or any of their predecessors, literally to make government run, you have pulled more and more power into the White House. There are enormous degrees of freedom for a president to act. There literally is a law, for example, that was passed in 1977. If you think back to 1977, it was oil embargo time. We have gasoline lines everywhere in the nation. Jimmy Carter's president, not going so well. He needs a tool to go whack the Middle East oil producers. He proposed, Congress passed, and he signed a law which gives the President of the United States the power to declare an international economic emergency under certain circumstances. And while that emergency is in effect, gives him the power to change any international trade agreement or other economic agreement. So when he stands up and says, I'm going to put tariffs on the Chinese or on the Mexicans, and everybody says, don't worry about it because he can't do that, absolutely positively wrong. He can do it, at least theoretically. Eventually it goes back to the Congress and they can undo it, but eventually in that world is irrelevant. What's relevant is, does the president have a lot of authority to do things outside the contiguous, outside the 50 states? He's got a lot of authority. Case in point, I'm sure you know the answer to this question. When was the last time the United States declared war? Answer, 1941. All of the conflict since then has not been war. Why don't we declare war? Despite the Constitution saying that the president has to go to the Congress, to the Senate, and ask for a declaration of war, it wasn't terribly convenient for all of the presidents since FDR, so they haven't. So Korea, Vietnam, none of this stuff was ever a war. We just did it. And as president, you can just do it. Again, on the Clinton side, Obama 3, I would make one point before you think that's really good news, and think about U.S.-Mexican migration policy over the last 2 years. Arguably, it has been the worst in our bilateral history, or pretty close to the worst. This has been a president and an administration that has not been, they've been overtly quite friendly to Mexico, but in practice, day to day, not so good. I'm going to stop there because I've probably depressed all of you, and because that thing is flashing at me. And I think thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that I have excited you with some questions. Thank you very much.
Alan. Yes, sir. Bien, vamos a iniciar con la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Como les comentaba, son 15 minutos. Tengo más de 40 preguntas, sería imposible leerlas todas en 15 minutos. Lo que les ofrezco es que las voy a ir leyendo como me fueron llegando. Hillary y Trump son dos personalidades muy diferentes, una muy rígida y política y el otro un showman. ¿Con quién crees que será más difícil negociar para México?
That is a perfect question. And in a weird way, I think Trump is easier to negotiate with. Trump is a deal maker. You don't like him, he doesn't like you, but it has nothing to do with negotiation. It's about defining in a negotiation where you start, where you're going, what you're willing to pay or what you're not willing to pay. And I'm persuaded that as much as I dislike his approach to issues, you give me a deal maker on the other side of the table, I can deal with that. The problem Secretary Clinton, President Clinton has, is that she has a party, as you saw with the popularity of Bernie Sanders over the last months, that is moving pretty fast and pretty far to the left. And by the left, I mean it is anti-trade. The Democrats have never been particularly good on trade. They've gotten dramatically worse on trade. She will be, as President Obama has been, a friend of Mexico, and that's good. I'm not sure that she would have the flexibility to do very much with and for Mexico. So I think it's a hard question to answer because they are so different, but I'm not sure I would make the case that Secretary Trump is a dramatically better alternative. The other thing I'd be very careful about, let's assume Clinton wins. Let's assume she sort of governs the way Obama is governed. 4 years from now, we're going to be sitting here and saying, oh my God, there are more angry Americans. The economy has had a recession. Washington is still dysfunctional. Trump's a has-been because he won't run a second time. And you don't know what you're going to get. There are wings and factions within the Republican Party that are very ideological, that make him look reasonable. Hard to say that in a single sentence. So the issue is not them. The issue is who's going to be better to solve what's wrong with the United States and put us back in track to behave like a reasonable country.
¿Apostarías a que la gente va a seguir confiando en los mercados y la democracia como una referencia para satisfacer sus expectativas? Y si no es así, ¿a qué le apostarían?
That, unfortunately, is an easy one. The answer is no. Why did Brexit win? Brexit won because half of the voters that turned up answered your question, we want to go back to something because the future is scary. We don't trust the EU. We don't trust our leaders. We're not happy with this. Same dynamic here, same dynamic in almost every country I know that's had elections recently. People are voting. They're enthusiastic about the promise of democracy. They're angry with what democracy has provided. Europe is a particularly bad problem because you can make the case, and I've talked to my friends who are parliamentarians. So you're out on the stump, you're out there trying to get voters to vote for you, and they say, well, do you control this? Do you control that? Do you control this? And they say, well, no, actually, the EU controls that. Who elected them? Nobody elects them. So we're getting this democratic gap developing all over the place, which separates what people want from what they're getting. That's producing, in my judgment, the kind of populism of right and left, both ways. It varies by country, depends on history, etc. Neither of those are going to make the situation better, either in terms of democracy or in terms of governance. So I'm a little bit concerned about the evolution of democracy as practiced in most countries.
El Brexit es la versión británica del apoyo a Trump y sus políticas proteccionistas hacia el exterior.
A couple-part answer. No one in this room, I suspect, has ever met a Brit who said, I'm a European. They have always had a fraught relationship with the continent. They were, of the major countries, the last to join the EU, partly because then the EC, the French, kept them out. They had always been the balancing act for the continental powers. They don't think of themselves as European. They don't think they have benefited, what the economists say notwithstanding, at least on balance, from participation in the EU. And so in a sense, it is, as I said when I was talking, make Britain great again was floating around. Immigration was also floating around. The immigration the Brits are concerned with is not from Syria or Africa, it's from Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary. And it's quite clear that the British, many of whom, particularly those who voted for Brexit, which tends to be rural, tends to be outside London and Scotland, those people want their village. They want their village not to change. They remember when it was a very comfortable place. They want to retire there. They don't want to worry about all this stuff. Now, that isn't great by any definition, but I think it's an accurate reflection of the 50% of the voters who voted to leave the EU.
Escuché que cuando leyeron tu currículum eras un experto en geopolítica. ¿Consideras que el Brexit provocará un cambio en el mediano plazo en la geopolítica de Europa al traer eventualmente más separaciones de países, como podría ser Escocia, Irlanda, Cataluña, País Vasco, etc.?
Yes, and the very short version is there really are only a couple possibilities. One is that over the next couple of years, the EU muddles through. They don't solve Greece. They don't solve immigration. They don't solve Brexit. They sort of dodge every bullet. The economy doesn't grow anymore. Jobs aren't created. They get smaller and smaller in terms of their international presence. That's what they've been doing. It's the most likely scenario. The second scenario is that all of the pressures on Europe accelerate. Several countries have already said, we want to have referenda, either on immigration or membership. Marine Le Pen in France, who will be a presidential candidate, has stood up and said, I'm going to campaign on France exiting the EU. The Hungarians rather, have stood up and said, we will accept nothing from Brussels in terms of migrants. You can just feel the EU, the centrifugal forces tearing it apart. That's the second scenario. The third scenario is somehow out of this mess, but it's got to get worse before it gets better, you get more Europe. There is no possibility of more Europe with 27 countries. What might be possible is that the original members, Germany, the Netherlands, a couple of the Scans maybe, Finland, get together and say, let's start over. We're willing to go ahead with common fiscal policy, common banking policy, tighter regulations, and they could do that. Everything else turns into a trade agreement. The question, unfortunately, is what about France? Can you have even a much reduced EU built only around Germany, put it differently, Germany gets bigger, or do you need that balance of France, which makes next year's French presidential election the absolutely critical answer to your question? The future of the EU is not a function of Donald Trump. The future of the EU is a function of the French elections in the spring and the German elections in the fall next year, because that will decide whether there's a European future or not. And we won't know it for a year and change.
Las últimas tres preguntas. Con el Brexit, ¿el Reino Unido dejará de ser la puerta de entrada de las empresas norteamericanas a la Unión Europea?
Yes. Yeah, but the longer version than yes is, as I said a couple times today, Brexit started a process that's going to run bump against walls, not in a very erratic kind of line over the next, not months, but years. Under EU law, they have 2 years to negotiate a new deal, and it could take longer than that. It's unknowable. What kind of rules will exist for investors in the UK? You can't even answer who's the UK, because Scotland has stood up and said, if Brexit happens, we're leaving too, we're going to Europe because we want to be over there. So the reason that everyone expects a recession, and perhaps a deep recession, in the UK is not because this was such a horrible idea, but because you've created unlimited uncertainty which won't go away for years. In that environment, nobody in their right mind would build a new plant, invest in a new company, however cheap the pound gets, go buy British assets, because you have no idea under what rules will those assets, that factory, that plant, that business, have to cope. That's why this is, in the short run, it's a bad idea on any definition. In the long run, maybe it's not so bad.
Después del Brexit, ¿hacer negocios con el Reino Unido será más caro?
Well, depends when the pound stops. So the short answer is no. This is a country which has its own currency. It's going to devalue dramatically. They're going to let it devalue dramatically because their only hope in the short run to boost growth is, in fact, to use their currency. So in a sense, in a very narrow sense, it's going to get cheaper to do business in the UK. But the question isn't doing business in the UK today. The question is doing business in the long run. Because again, nobody's going to invest for what happens the rest of this year. They care about a 10-year time horizon, and it's an unanswerable question. The flip side of that is also true, by the way. You have no idea what conditions in Europe are going to be. A little less uncertain, obviously. But you're going to see a dramatic drop-off of investment in Europe as well. And that capital is going to flow to the Americas in particular, perhaps to other parts of the world. You can make a case, which I wouldn't make very loudly, that as Europe slows yet further, the opportunities of capital coming into the United States, Mexico, Brazil, elsewhere, go up, not down.
La última pregunta. El Brexit, Trump, el Bronco, aquí en Nuevo León, ¿es un movimiento anti-establishment? ¿Es la solución correcta?
The first question is easy, the second question impossible. Is it anti-establishment? Yes. Everything we know about most countries, certainly most countries that behave like liberal democracies more or less, is that people are unhappy with what passes for leadership today. They want something else. Independent candidates in Mexico, Trump in the United States, Brexit, Podemos. The story goes on and on and on. It's true in Slovakia. It's true in Germany. We're seeing it everywhere. People are offered, you can vote for the usual stuff or you can vote for him. They're choosing at the margin him. Why or her? Because they don't see the current system, they meaning the majority of voters, as in their interest. They think the system is rigged. And arguably the systems are rigged. Hence income inequality dramatically getting larger in the United States, etc. Brazil, you're in the process of wiping out an entire generation of political leadership. It's corruption. It's called corruption today. Yesterday it was, well, just how Brazil works. So we're in this period where the sense among voters in many, many countries is that the systems are rigged, the elite benefit and they don't, and if you're going to actually let me vote, I'm going to vote the other way. Tiny example, because it's not necessarily new. I grew up in the Midwest of the United States. In the Midwest, our public schools are all locally funded. That is to say, each town literally votes the tax to pay for local education. Something weird started happening in the 70s. We'd have these votes on millage rates, as they were called, and they started losing. Town after town after town was voting against their millage rate. And this was weird because you'd go interview them and they'd say, yeah, I've got kids. Yeah, my kids are in the school. Yep, school needs money. How'd you vote? I voted against it. Was that rational or irrational? Answer, it's the only thing we let them vote on. So given the opportunity to vote on it, they said, great, I'm voting. And I'm voting against what all of us would say was their own self-interest, but they were trying to send a message. They were trying to tell politicians it's broken. And that was in the 70s. I read Brexit, I read Trump, I read Podemos, blah, 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 as trying to send a message. I read Bronco as trying to send a message. The system is broken, it's not working, fix it or else. So you say, well, you're going to vote stupidly, you're going to vote emotionally. Yeah, why not?
Alan, muchísimas gracias por tu participación. Muy interesante, la verdad.